For this homework assignment, you are asked to do exercises 4.4, problems 2, 3, 5, 6, 8, 9, 11, 12, 14, and 15. You are asked to first identify whether or not the passage contained an inductive argument or deductive argument, and then, if it is a deductive argument, determine whether or not the argument is valid or invalid. Beginning with problem number 2. Barbara is a liberal. She's a strong advocate of environmentalism, and most environmentalists are liberals. And this is an example of an inductive argument. And this argument was somewhat easy to identify given that we had this indicator phrase, most environmentalists are liberals. That tells us that we're not dealing with a conclusion that is based on absolute certainty, but one that is only likely or probable to be true. We're making a generalization about people within this class of individuals. Number 3, all Romans are Italians, all Italians are Europeans, so Romans are Europeans. This is an example of a deductive argument. And there are two ways we can check to ensure that it's a deductive argument. One, we can ask, does the conclusion follow with certainty from the premises? Or rather, I should say, is it intended that the conclusion follow with certainty from the premises? Another way we can look at it is we can ask, is the conclusion composed of only concepts that are presented in the premises? And the answer to both of those questions is yes. With respect to the second question, look right here at the two terms contained within the conclusion. It says, so Romans are Europeans. And the term Romans, it appears right here, and that term Romans, it also appears in the very first premise. Europeans, well, that appears in the second premise. And so the conclusion, so Romans are Europeans, is composed of concepts or terms that are taken strictly from the premises. This is an example of not only a deductive argument, but a valid deductive argument. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must follow with absolute certainty, and there's no way possible to even conceive of a scenario in which the premises are true and the conclusion is possibly false. This is also an example of a type of argument I referred to in the video lecture on inductive and deductive arguments, which I there call class containment. Notice it's talking about the classes of things. Romans, this is a class of things. Are Italians, a class of things. Are Europeans. And it's trying to draw an inference based on individuals that populate those classes. Number 5, if a triangle has angles of 30 degrees and 60 degrees, then its third angle is 90 degrees. If a triangle is 90 degrees, then it is a right triangle. So if a triangle has angles of 30 degrees and 60 degrees, then it is a right triangle. This is a deductive argument. Notice that in this argument, the conclusion contains terms that are entirely expressed in the two premises. Right here, if a triangle has angles of 30 degrees and 60 degrees, notice that is the exact same phrase that appears if a triangle has angles of 30 in the subject term of the first premise. Then right here, then it is a right triangle. And then if we look up here, it is a right triangle. So the two main terms in the conclusion appear in the exact wording and the exact phraseology in the premises. So the conclusion is really more or less just a rearrangement of concepts that appear in the premises. And this is also a valid argument. And if you just reflect on it and think about it a little bit, you'll see that there's no way possible to think of a scenario in which the two premises are true and the conclusion is possibly false. Number 6, thanks to St. Patrick, no snake lives in Ireland. Since snakes are reptiles, that means no reptiles live in Ireland. And this is also a deductive argument. Notice that once again, the two main terms in the conclusion appear in the premises. Here we have reptiles, and then the word reptiles appears in the second premise. Live in Ireland appears in the very first premise. So this is a deductive argument. However, it is an invalid argument because we can assume, let's assume that the first premise is true, that because of St. Patrick, no snake lives in Ireland. And then let's assume the second premise is true, that snakes are reptiles. Well, it still might be the case that there are other reptiles that live within Ireland. Maybe turtles live in Ireland. So this is not a valid deductive argument. This is one in which it's intended that the conclusion follow strictly from the premises with absolute certainty. It just fails to accomplish that. Number 8, no machine is capable of perpetual motion because every machine is subject to friction, and nothing that is subject to friction is capable of perpetual motion. This is an example of a deductive argument, just like the previous ones. The conclusion consists of terms that are borrowed strictly from the premises. And this is also an example of a valid deductive argument. It is valid because, assuming that the premises are true, there's no way to conceive of a scenario in which the conclusion could be false. So the premises do guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Number 9, either Jesus was telling the truth when he said he was the Son of God, or he was insane. But he wasn't insane, so he was actually the Son of God. And this is also a deductive argument. Notice this is a different kind of deductive argument than we've seen before. I've given you guys a couple of examples of different deductive arguments. One was, I said, hypothetical. If A, then B, A, therefore B. Another one was what I call class containment, where we're talking about all members of one class belong to this other class, all members of that class belong to another. But this is A or B, not A, or actually not B, therefore A. It's what is called, just getting a little ahead of ourselves, but a disjunctive syllogism, or a disjunctive argument. It's an either or kind of argument. And it's saying A or B, in this case, not B, therefore A. And this is an example of a valid argument. So here, once again, we have an example of a deductive argument, because you can't imagine a way in which the premises could be true and the conclusion be false. Number 11, if the tectonic plates under the Atlantic Ocean are moving apart, there will be volcanic, I think I left a word out, there will be volcanic activity in Iceland. And there is volcanic activity there. Therefore, the tectonic plates are separating. This is a deductive argument. The reason it's a deductive argument, or a way we can conclude that it is we look at the conclusion and we ask, is the conclusion composed of terms that appear in the premises, or made up solely, I should say, made up solely of concepts that appear in the premises? And the answer is yes, it is. Here we have this is an abbreviated version here, but what this is saying in the conclusion is the tectonic plates under the Atlantic Ocean, and then right here it's saying are separating. So this is in fact composed of terms that appear in the premises, and only terms that appear in the premises. But this is an example of an invalid argument, and the reason it's invalid is you have to look at what's being said. If the tectonic plates under the Atlantic Ocean are moving apart, there will be volcanic activity in Iceland. There is volcanic activity, therefore the tectonic plates are moving apart, or separating. This argument has the following form. It's saying, if A, then B, B, therefore A. We could also imagine, say, well, look, maybe there's volcanic so there's volcanic activity, but maybe there's volcanic activity for reasons other than the tectonic plates are separating. I'm not a geologist, so I don't know what actually causes volcanic activity, but here, let's just get creative. Say a mad scientist took a laser beam and shined it into a volcano, and that's what caused the the volcanic activity. I know that's crazy, but when you don't know geology well enough to know what causes volcanic activity, you have to get creative. But in this case, then what we have is an argument in which the premises are true, because let's assume if the tectonic plates move, there'll be volcanic activity. Let's assume there is volcanic activity, but it's due to the mad scientist. Well, then therefore it would be, both premises would be true, but yet the conclusion could possibly be false. And actually, I came up with that imaginative scenario in order to illustrate this point again, is that as long as you can conceive of a way, no matter how bizarre or silly or stupid it is, in which the premises are true and the conclusion is false, then the argument is invalid. So this is an example of an invalid argument. Number 12, everything we know about was created at a certain point in time as a result of causes that existed before. So the universe itself must have been created by a being that existed before the universe. And this is an example of an inductive argument. And there are a couple of reasons why I think it's inductive, but the main one is that the conclusion is jumping or adding new information that is not contained in the premise. Notice the premise is talking about, it says everything we know about was created at a certain time before as a result of things that came before it. And then all of a sudden it starts talking about the universe and it starts talking about a being that existed before the universe. But the universe was never specifically talked about in the premise. In fact, I mean, what it's talking about is everything we know about. We don't know about the whole universe. We have a much more limited knowledge than whatever knowledge we have of the universe. And in fact, the first premise is talking about our knowledge of things, whereas in the conclusion, it's not talking about knowledge at all. It's talking about the universe itself. So there's a jump there. Not only is a jump there, but then it's talking about being that existed before the universe, which that doesn't even come up at all in the first premise. So this argument is inductive because it's extending our knowledge beyond what is contained within the premises. So again, that's an example of an inductive argument. Number 14, either healthcare is a right or it is something that individuals have to earn. Since healthcare is something that is earned, it isn't a right. And this is an example of a deductive argument, and this is probably the most difficult problem in the entire homework assignment because, and I'm betting everybody got this wrong, but this is actually an invalid argument. And it's invalid for reasons that are a little difficult to explain, but basically you have to think of a way in which the premises could be true and the conclusion could possibly be false. And it might be the case that healthcare is a right and it is something that is earned. The problem with when you have either or arguments is that the word or is actually an ambiguous term. And we use the word or in ordinary English to mean sometimes this or that and not both. We also use the word or sometimes to be what's called inclusive, which can mean this, that, or both. And it is possible that you could you say, well, healthcare is a right and it is also something that you have to earn. Let me give another example which will maybe make this make more sense. Suppose I said something like, well, you have to be clever or hardworking in order to pass this class. John is clever, therefore he's not hardworking. Well, couldn't he be both? Couldn't he be both clever and hardworking? I mean, there's nothing logically untoward or unsavory about saying he's both smart and hardworking, or both clever and hardworking. So the same applies here. When you have an or statement, if you say A or B, just because A is true doesn't mean B is false. Now, if you recall the earlier example we talked about where you had A or B, not B, therefore A. If you negate one of the two terms, then the other one will be true. But just because you affirm and you say one of the two terms is true, that doesn't mean the other one is false. So it doesn't kind of work both ways. You can always deny one of the two terms, one of the two sides of the or statement. You can deny one of those, and then that means the other one is true. But just because you affirm or say one is true doesn't mean the other one is false. I know that was a little unclear, but just keep it in mind that it could be the case that healthcare is both a right and it is something that is earned. Finally, we come to this one. The economic crisis of 2008-2009 is like the panic of 1873 in that it was caused by a bubble in real estate, after which banks severely tightened their lending practices and both consumers and businesses were hobbled by the inability to get loans. The recession of the 1870s lasted more than 3 years, so today's economy will likely take that long to recover. And this one I thought was pretty easy. It's an inductive argument, and what makes this one easy is the word likely. As soon as you see that, you should have instantly been thinking inductive argument. So hopefully you got these all right, and the ones that you missed, you have a better understanding of why that is. We'll be doing more of these types of exercises as the semester continues, but hopefully we've covered enough at this point to give you a general sense of the difference between inductive arguments, deductive arguments, as well as a general sense of when a deductive argument is valid or invalid. Actually, as we move forward this semester, pretty much everything we're going to be studying is going to be about deductive validity as we move forward. Actually, you could spend several semesters just on that, believe it or not. But we are going to be covering that in more and more detail.